All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and back, Alhamdulillah, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So let us first go over. I know we kind of, had a couple days, actually, 2 days. That's couple, right? It doesn't fall a couple in English, but we're just gonna call it a couple days. Okay, let's see. Inna rabbaka huwa, well, actually 3 days. Inna rabbaka huwa a'lamu man yudillu an sabilihi wa huwa a'lam bil muhtadin. Let's go over the idea first. And we said وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا, or وعدلا, to give that قلقلة right there. لا مبدل لكلماته وهو السميع العليم. The words of your Lord Almighty had been completed in honesty, in truth, وعدلا, in justice. لا مبدل لكلماته, no change, no alteration to his words. وهو السميع العليم, and he is the all-knowing, all-hearing, and all-knowing. And of course, we talked about this ayah being the theme, and that basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know the different options out there that people will use and as an epistemology, as a resource to basically defining ethics, morality, justice, etc. So Islam comes in and says, well, let's discuss some of those resources or epistemologies that you would depend on, whether we're speaking about one having some kind of an inspiration from shayateen and thinking of it, that somehow it's basically coming from speculation. And then perhaps you would think that, yes, we can probably just let's vote on this and see how many people would think it's a good idea. If we have a major vote, then we're going to assume that that was basically the best idea, the best option, and the best thing to do. And certainly the Quran goes also in details and tells us, well, now you recognize يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ, they would follow speculation, وَمَا تَهْوَى الْأَنفُسِ, and what their hearts or what they would desire, or وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى, with the same concept, with the same idea. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا لَا مُبَدِّلَ لِكَلِمَاتِهِ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. And certainly, إِنَّ رَبَّكَ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ مَن يُضِلُّ عَن سَبِيلِهِ وَهُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِالْمُهْتَدِينَ. At the end, so this inference is that your Lord Almighty knows who is embracing his words and who's actually going off the track of guidance. So therefore, you would basically recognize that in practice, there's a certain practice you as a Muslim, you would basically follow, whether we're speaking about the way you eat, the way you drink, the way you practice culture, the way you practice different things in your life. Remember, you would connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You would let your centricity be around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when your center is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when you would be capable of recognizing the different orbits by taking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as your definition to guidance. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving us this one, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, and eat what had Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name mentioned on it, if you were true believers in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words. And why do you not eat from what was mentioned, or what had Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name mentioned on it, when he had given you the details of what was forbidden upon you, except or unless you had fallen in necessity, in a certain necessity. وَإِنَّ كَثِيرًا لَيُضِلُّونَ بِأَهْوَائِهِمْ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ, and many would delude you based on their own desires with no knowledge. For your Lord Almighty knows who the transgressors are. So what is that supposed to tell us? A couple things. We talked about darura last time. We talked about necessity, and we said in terms of necessity, we're talking about necessity looking at the 5 legal maxims in the religion: the deen, the nafs, the aql, the ird, the mal, talked about the 5 legal maxims, the preservation of nafs, the preservation of deen, which is basically the first one, the preservation of life, the preservation of mental health and or mind, the preservation of chastity, and the preservation of wealth. So in that situation, we basically had given a couple different legal maxims that would, let's call it, they would be subcategories of the main legal maxim, which is الضرورات تبيح المحظورات, that necessity permits الضرورات تبيح المحظورات, the things that basically were considered or are considered as محظورات, as forbidden things. So we talked about the details in some of those things. The other thing is that there is something called darura. Forgot to talk about that. I'm just gonna talk about it just a little bit. I'm not gonna go in so much detail. There's something called, let's write it down, right? Let's write it down right there. There are الضرورات, and those would be the necessities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically the 5 necessities in our life, okay? The D-N-A-I-M. We're just going to write the D-N-A-I-M next to it so you would remember it. We know the DNA, Deen, Nafs, Aql, Aql, we just did that one, okay? And the other one is al-hajiyat, okay? And then there's the tahsinat, okay? Let's look at that. So what's the difference between al-hajiyat? Al-hajiyat, their needs, but they don't go up to as a darurat. In other words, they are not things that would affect your life, meaning if they're not there, you will die. For example, that does not fall within al-hajiyat. Let me give you an example within your appliances, okay? Al-hajiyat. Right now, a refrigerator is extremely important. It's hajiyat. Refrigerator is extremely important, and certainly, you don't expect to be in a house without a refrigerator, okay? But when you look at a microwave, well, you can survive without a microwave, right? You can survive without a microwave. It's a plus, so that would be tahsinat, okay? It's a plus, that would be tahsinat. It's not necessarily something that you would have to have. It would be a plus thing, but if you have a stove, hey, al-hajiyat is more like a stove. I need a source of fire, so that would be hajiyat, okay? Al-darurat would be, no, we need food and we need drinking. Well, basically, drinking source. That's darurat, okay? Now, it would be hajiyat to have perhaps maybe water coming from the tap, but it would be darurat that I would have it, whether that was spring water, whether that was a lake, not salt water, and whether that was a tap, that would be, if it's a tap, that would be hajiyat. But darurat would be that I would have that resource available, okay? So when you look at darurat and you look at hajiyat, just giving you an example on the different appliances at home, for example, okay? That's the same thing that we would look at the different pluses. And this is very important to look at these categories. Can I survive with this? Can I not survive without having these, and what does this look like? So when you look at الضرورات الحاجيات التحسينات, it basically helps you understand the resources that you have, how necessary they are, and how much you can survive without these. Many times people may exaggerate and consider hajiyat as darurat. Okay. And this is extremely dangerous sometimes because they could be these fine lines and say, yeah, well, I need a car and I don't want to fix it frequently, so I would need to get a loan to get a car. And we would say, wait a minute, that's not, and they'll say, الضرورات تبيح المحظورات. I need a car, and therefore I would like to get a loan, basically an interest loan. And we would say, wait a minute, no, because you do have the option to get a car without a loan, and or perhaps get a non-interest loan, or probably borrow some money or work for some time to buy, I don't know, a $5,000 car, and instead of getting a loan and getting into interest. So Islam tells you, well, wait a minute, you need to really get a fatwa from scholars to make sure that you're not letting your hawa and your simplified understanding of darurat and hajiyat and tahsinat affect your final judgment in thinking that, yes, darurat تبيح المحظورات, I need this, therefore I should consider it as a darura. Needs and wants are completely different. Okay, so darurat, they're basically things that life depends on them. We're talking about the DNA I am. Okay, so if, let's say, somebody needed a heart transplant, and they said, well, the heart transplant, this kind of valve, we could only take it from pigs because they were the only ones that matched the human valve. Is this permissible? Yes, it is. Why? Because the preservation of nafs and preservation of life is actually considered as darura. It's considered as a necessity. And even if Islam had considered it haram, considered that, well, إِلَّا مَا اضْطُرِرْتُمْ إِلَيْهِ. Just as it would be haram to eat pork unless there was a necessity, then in that situation, we would say, okay, then there's a necessity that allows you to eat pork because nothing else was available. That's the same thing. If there isn't a halal option available out there, and they couldn't find, let's say, a halal source for having, and let's say making a transplant or something that would fit for a transplant, but a haram resource or a najis resource, let's use the word najis, or impure, that basically would mean that إِلَّا مَا اضْطُرِرْتُمْ إِلَيْهِ. If we had the necessity and there was the only thing to basically have this person survive on was this transplant that comes from pigs, then we're going to say that would be permissible to use if life depends on it. Same thing, we're looking at different types of drugs, different types of pharmaceutical, medical drugs, etc. Those things, some of those medical drugs, they may lead to some form of sedation, some form of perhaps loss of mind. And yes, it does differ from the straight drugs that make you lose your mind in a different way. But in some cases, we're talking about using, let's say, using certain drugs, even though they're considered medical drugs. But if you were to use them in heavy dosage, that they will give you a form of sedation, a form of what we would say as feeling high. Okay, so we're talking about things like Percocet, overdosing on that, or overdosing on certain other medications, maybe Tylenol or whatever it is. Don't think anybody would use that as a form of drug for, like Percocet, but you would see others actually using different kinds of drugs to overdose. And even though they're medical drugs, but in order to get some form of feeling high, the way that they would use with street drugs. Okay, but of course, just because it is a medical drug, okay, that does not mean that it's permissible to use, unless we're speaking about prescribed by doctors and there was no other alternative to help that person treat the pain or treat their illness except with that drug. Okay, that's a different situation. And we did talk about that in details. And I told you that I had written a whole a whole piece in like 33 pages, and it was published by AMJA, the American Muslim Jurist Council in the US. So you can go back to that. It's available online for free. Okay, so and we also talked about the reasoning behind the revelation of that ayah. And what about gelatin capsules? Okay, well, for gelatin, okay, you jumped off of the subject, but I'll talk about it, and I'll talk about it in just a bit. Remind me of that. Okay. ولا تأكلوا مما لم يذكر اسم الله عليه. So the reason for that revelation was the disbelievers, they basically had wanted to debate the believers. And they said, and debate the Prophet and say that they said, well, why would you consider? So they wanted to use a sense of logic. And they said, why would it be logical for you to eat what you would slaughter, but something that was killed or died in a natural death, you would consider that as not holy or not acceptable to eat. So they considered that if God's intervention, if these things died naturally, then it should be considered as healthy, as permissible to eat, because it's God's intervention or nature's intervention. Then therefore you should allow yourself to consider that that should also be as holy / as acceptable as you intervening and really slitting that animal's throat and you slaughtering it yourself. So that's when a couple things to say. Okay, that was their method to debate the Muslims and say, well, here's the problem with your logic. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting them know the problem with that logic is not necessarily thinking that, yeah, I've got my own analogy. I can make my analogy, and based on that analogy, I can say, hey, this is a natural death, and this is you putting that animal to death. Then why did you say this was permissible and that is not permissible? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting them know that analogy is not always accurate. Is not always accurate in determining whether something is ethical or not, or whether something is good or not. Sometimes your own analogy may go wrong in how you may assess the data or probably process the interpretation. So keep that one in mind. You may assess the data and think that you have the complete information in regards to that data and then process a certain interpretation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting them know that not the data and certainly not the interpretation and the way they process the interpretation is actually accurate. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is getting them to what's more important. I'm not going to explain to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't explain all the details in data and didn't explain the processing method that they had used, but he explained one thing, is that the resource, your brain, cannot fully act as let's say the standard that you would necessarily fully depend on, and your one or your own intuition to think that that is enough to depend on in considering something as right or wrong. Your intuition can go wrong in its evaluation or in its reading the data or even processing the interpretation. Same thing with your brain. It can misread the data and may even process the wrong interpretation for that data that the brain had recorded, whether we're speaking about empirical or whether we're speaking about anecdotal, it would still fall short. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving us that alternative and said, well, the center should be that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded a matter to being halal, a matter to being acceptable, whether that was in food, as in this ayah here talking about the example of food, or whether this is talking about clothes, or whether this is talking about social relations, or whether this is talking about transactions, or whatever it is. If we are to speak about defining the epistemology, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the center to basically help us recognize how we read the data, which may sometimes give you some form of data to help give you some links and some tools to see the data, but not necessarily always that would be the complete piece of information. So remember this one: you're basically having the data and reading the data and processing the interpretation for the data could actually go wrong, and both can go wrong. So in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know that al-i'tida, that transgressing the limit, would basically be if the person had transgressed the limit and went beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's one, the way that he would give you the data, two, and basically process that interpretation. Al-i'tida would be once you go off the center. Okay, keep that one in mind. Once you go off the center, what center? Is the center would be if you had considered your speculation, your mind processing, or your own intuition / your own desires basically be that resource, the epistemology, that reference that you would turn to. That's where the i'tidat started. I'tidat started when you went off in recognizing the center that would help you define ethics, define truth, define tawheed. And this is extremely important. When we say the center is Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then is telling you, you see, Tawheed in itself is actually the center to help you define right and wrong, and it's not necessarily just going off the details. Think of it this way. Okay, when you see these ayat, what is the ayat telling you? The ayat is telling you that you may disagree with, let's say, maybe feminism, or you may disagree with certain definitions of whether something is acceptable or not, maybe based on a nationality, based on a culture, etc., based on certain feelings, all of these different things. Those are not the center. Those are the details. Just because you agree with perhaps some ideas that feminism might propose, or a certain nationality, or a certain culture, or a certain idea that communism might propose, or democracy might propose, etc. That's the detail. The center that you should be focusing on is this based on the center of Tawheed or not? Way even before you look at the data. If you're just looking at the margins, then you're really confusing. You're seeing kind of like the aesthetics. You're looking at the appearance and you're not looking at the core. Just because some things in the appearance may seem like they overlap with some of the things that Islam says, that does not make it as something that is close to Islam. And this is extremely important. Let's give an idea. Feminism. Okay, some of the things that the feminist would say in terms of narrative, or some of the words that they may say, may sound like, hey, I mean, yeah, that's what Islam would support. Okay, regardless of some of the other details. Okay, but yeah, Islam says that. And then for us to say, well, yeah, I'm a feminist. Well, we would say, wait a minute, how are you a feminist here? She would say, well, I mean, Islam is pro women's rights. Islam says that women have the right to choose the person that they want to marry. Islam says that too. Islam says that that women are to be considered as equal. Well, yes and no, but well, hypothetically, we'll just agree for a bit, and we would say then that she would come up to the conclusion and say, "See, Islam is a feminist religion." Yeah, some of the details. I mean, we can have a new feminist interpretation, and we can say Muslim feminist. I would say, wait a minute. No, we can't. Why not? Just because you had seen some of the subcategories, basically may agree in the interpretation of some of the things with Islam, that does not necessarily mean that we can have feminism be, or can call it Islamic feminism, because the center of Islam is Tawheed. The center of Islam is Tawheed. So we would go back to Quran and Sunnah, and that acts as our epistemology. That acts as a resource. Then the way that somebody might read certain data or create certain interpretation, that interpretation and that data is basically coming from the main resource, which, if you were to consider the brain as the resource, then Islam will tell you, well, that is making homocentricity. That is making you as the center. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that you are not the center. The center is Allah. You, the homocentricity, you as a human being, being the center, and what defines right, wrong, individualism, what defines our interest, how we read the data, how we interpret it, etc. If you're going to say it's the humans that do it, then Islam tells you, sorry, but that's shirk. We're not going to agree on that from the beginning. Islam tells you, no, the center is Allah. He is the one to basically turn to in one, how you read the data and how you interpret the data. For a feminist, they would say it's the data is the female mind. That's the center. That's how we're going to consider the angle of reading, the lens, the center, and how we would basically define the world around us is going to be based on female perspective and not the text and not the way. Okay, same thing if you were to look at the interpretation. We're going to interpret it based on, let's say, the Western or different influences out there. Then what are we looking at? Then we're looking at these different interpretations and the data basically going off what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is considered as the center. So think of it this way. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us, well, before you would even look at the interpretation and before you would even look at the data, you would have to look at, is this shirk, or is this based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's why he said, وَهُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِالْمُعْتَدِينَ, because al-i'tida is not speaking about whether they had eaten halal food or not. To not eat halal food, that's a sin. Okay? But to disregard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the center of defining your parameters in what makes something as ethical or not ethical. If you had regarded human mind, or what they would call right now, scientism or science, or say human mind, intelligence, what studies say, etc. We're going to say, wait a minute, you said what studies say, what science says, etc. But that's basically the human mind. That is within the parameter of dhann. That is within the parameter of dhann and doubt. So therefore, for a Muslim, before you would analyze anything, Islam tells you, wait a minute, I need you to look at the source. I need you to free your mind from the different influences that may create a certain bias and make you somehow submit to other than Allah Almighty. And I want you to free yourself. And I want you to recognize that that center is Allah Almighty. And therefore, even if my interpretation, which maybe as a result of my own culture, or perhaps the data that I might be getting, maybe because I had put in a certain experience, so we're doing an anecdotal, or whether it is empirical and we had studies say some certain things, we're going to say, well, wait a minute, al-Islamu ya'alu wa la yu'la. Islam is the highest thing. We're going to go back to Islam. And then why will I do that? Well, that's because I said La ilaha illallah. That's because I said La ilaha illallah. And I recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the center of truth. And therefore, if a study were to probably give me certain data, I'm going to doubt the study, and I'm going to doubt the data, and I'm going to doubt the interpretation, but not doubt Allah. But not doubt Allah. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَتَعْلَمُنَّ نَبَأَهُ بَعْدَ حِينٍ. You will know the truth of it later on. If I had a study that basically was an antagonist to what Islam had said, I'm going to be not doubting Allah, but I'll doubt the study. I'll say, oh, something's wrong with the study. This needs restudying. There's no way that that can be the truth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَتَعْلَمُنَّ نَبَأَهُ بَعْدَ حِينٍ. And you'll know the truth of it, even when time will later come and you will see the truth. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had delivered all and everything in truth. So doubt your data reading, and doubt your dhann, and doubt your processing for that data, the interpretation, il-hawa, and how you interpret it. But don't doubt your Lord Almighty. Because why? Because وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا. Because the truth basically comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the foundation. The words of your Lord Almighty had come with complete truth. So doubt your data collection and adla, and the interpretation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give is all in justice. So therefore, make sure you free yourself from all the different influences out there, the different isms, or perhaps the different influences that may affect your data reading or affect your interpretation. And then many would want to, let's say, belong to a certain group. And this is especially, I would say probably within the ages of maybe perhaps 18, 17, 18, and probably maybe 35, I would say within that age group, okay? It kind of reduces as you get older, but there's a certain age, a prime age, just like a child. I remember my child one time, he came to me from school and he said, Mom, can I change my last name? I said, why do you want to do that? And he said, well, because there's so many kids with this last name, and which is my last name. And I have mashallah, like a large family in Minnesota, and he wanted to use my last name because I have a lot of family members in that school, and his last name is different. So he wanted to feel a sense of belonging. So he said, can I use your last name instead? I said, well, wait a minute. You could tell a child it's okay if you feel that, it gives you a sense of belonging, that it's okay. It's not a big deal. But no, at that age, we have to teach the children how to recognize the center of truth. Said, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? It says, "Ud'uuhum li'abaihim." Call them and trace them back to their fathers' names. ادعوهم لآبائهم يزي لأمهاتهم. So you are a proud Muslim that recognizes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told you, I want you to use your father's name. That's your sense of belonging, at least to what traces your ancestry. I want you to use that. And therefore, what are you teaching? You're teaching them that your identity is not necessarily the name. Those are details. your identity is how you recognize the center of truth. Same thing when people would grow older. I would say within 17, 18, they would go to enter college. And then, of course, on college campuses, they would have just different student senates, student councils, just different groups. This group is called the feminist. That group is called an LGBT. This group is probably called the Black Lives Matter. That group is called this and this. And then they would join these groups, and it kind of gives them a sense of activism, a sense of belonging. And of course, there's a lot of political correctness within each and every single group. And some would want to, hey, let's do an MSA, but the MSA sometimes, a lot of things that we could talk about that's something to later discuss, but definitely still join the MSA. Okay, the Muslim Student Association, the Muslim student groups, and all of those, definitely still join those. All right, but at the same time, make sure you put in the influence. Of course, within that age group, they would begin at on university campuses, wanting to feel that they belong to a certain group. And certainly the professors would also sometimes, address these certain groups. So it gives them a sense of, yes, I belong to this group. That you remember that Charlie Kirk and all of that, he was going on college campuses to make these I guess debates with the students, etc. And that's quite smart, but at the same time, I will tell you, going on college campuses, they wouldn't necessarily allow anybody to just go and just talk there and start debating with the students. Okay, so you would actually, unless you would buy a venue, and you would, I guess, buy the space from the college campus and from the university, and do your lectures there, and or do your activities there, you could actually do that. And I would say college campuses are probably the most important places that we should be doing our activism in. They're extremely important because the students there within that age group, they're looking for a sense of identity. They're looking for a new sense of identity. They're looking for groups. They're looking for areas that would challenge their mind. And college campuses are filled with these types of divisions. And if we were to do dawah on college campuses, I would say, it's one of the most important places to, even if it's a table, you're passing out flyers, or even if it's probably, giving a lecture, or maybe, hey, just standing on campus and just talking about Islam and just being available. Hey, if you have a question, I'm here. You can ask me questions, and here's what I'm going to talk about. And, I've given so many lectures on so many campuses, and I will tell you, there were so many cases where they had just passed by that hall. They just passed by the hall. They were just passing by and overhearing what I was saying. They just happened to be going to the cafeteria. And that's probably the best place that you could do a lecture in, is a cafeteria, because people are going there to eat. They're just listening, and probably just get on their leisure time, or probably their break, and etc. And they've got the time to basically listen. Some are going to be on their phones, etc. But you would be there, and they can hear some of what you're saying. And I've had a couple people actually become Muslim just by joining those lectures that they had not planned to join. And they came in really to grab something to eat. And then they listened to some of those words. And then that brought in the attraction, that brought in the curiosity to know. And of course, ironically, I'll tell you, I was wearing the niqab, okay? You would think that wearing the niqab was going to act as a barrier, but believe it or not, it actually acted as a place of attraction. It actually acted as a place where people wanted to know, who these people were, or at least can a niqabi actually speak proper English? Can a niqabi actually, speak it in a way that she can deliver a message? What can we ask her? And now, they can have this space where, go ahead and ask me questions. What would you like to know? And it was something that was really bringing in a lot of curiosity to really just see, the speaker and have the chance to question, have the chance to somehow, sometimes debate even, and all of that. And I would say, stand firm on your faith and don't change the way that you practice Islam to somehow think that it's gonna be easier for people to find it closer to their culture. And I would say practice what you would like to be in as a Muslim. Okay, don't try to fit in and somehow appear that, hey, I'm like you. And this is a very common mistake that a lot of the Muslims that are doing dawah in the US or in the West would do, always trying to tell them that, see, we're just like you. Because the second that you continue as that's your main slogan, we're just like you, then you have nothing to present. But the second you come in and say, we are different, and here's what we have to present, that's when it's going to be provocative in the beginning. And then later on, it's going to be, one, you had stayed firm on your faith, and two, you had given them the curiosity to come and actually see how different, what is different. But if you're going to say, hey, we're as Western as can be, we're as American as can be, we are basically as liberal as can be, as etc., then what really do you have to present? If that means I could stay the way I am and I could be just fine, and you've got nothing different because you're trying to compete with me. You're trying to prove that you are as liberal as I am, or as whatever category that you want to put yourself in, that you're trying to say that you are as secular, as democratic, as Western as can be, and you are trying to compete with my Westernization or my Western identity. Then if you're trying to, then I'm telling you that I'm the organic, I'm the original American, the original Western. And if you're trying to compete with me, then you know what? I'm going to tell you that you are not the original, and you are basically the one that is the synthetic one. And I'll basically tell you that, no, we're not going to accept you. So I'll tell you, they will never, no group is going to accept you until you would, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, وَلَن تَرْضَى عَنْكَ الْيَهُودُ وَلَا النَّصَارَى حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, they will not accept you till you follow their faith, the religion, the different religions, Christianity and Judaism. At least it was within that context. But that's the same is going to be with Hindu, the same is going to be with Buddhist, and the list goes on and on. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't try to intimidate or to imitate or somehow feel that in order to show that you are as they are, or as somehow to appear that in order for them to tolerate you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, don't look for their tolerance. Don't let that be your center. Look for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acceptance. Look for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be content over you and not their acceptance. Because the second that you would get into continuing to change, they're never going to say it's enough. They're never going to say it's enough until you completely leave your religion. Why? Because they would look at, I want you to leave the center. That's what they want. They want you to leave the center from La ilaha illallah to saying that they are the center. That they are different. Their definition of the center is the center. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us right there, Inna rabbaka huwa a'lam bil mu'tadin. Your Lord Almighty knows who the transgressors are. وَذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَهُ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَكْسِبُونَ الْإِثْمَ سَيُجْزَوْنَ بِمَا كَانُوا يَقْتَرِفُونَ. Now going for the details. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, then avoid and leave the sins. Which sins? The ones that basically had been defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as sin. Whether we're speaking about the apparent sin or whether we're speaking about the internal sin. And we talked about the apparent and the internal. In the apparent, whether we're speaking about a certain behavioral sin, okay? And internal would basically be certain maybe intentions or perhaps things that would cross your mind, envy, hate, all of that. That's internal. I would like to add on to that one. And we mentioned before, there are two different ways to knowledge in Islam. Okay, there's one that basically comes from teaching, preaching, okay, teaching, preaching, and basically giving you the information, okay, that's one side of knowledge. There's another side of knowledge, which is through discipline, that you have to walk the walk. I may be able to explain to a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old certain ideas and say, well, here's how the logic to this plays out. But there are certain ideas that, I'm sorry, I won't be able to explain the logic to you, but there's going to come a time where your brain will develop to fully understand. And one thing I could tell you is that I want you to walk the walk of discipline, the way that Islam told you, ذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَهُ. Avoid sin, whether we're speaking about behavioral or whether we're speaking about internal sin, by walking that path of avoiding sin, that is what is going to basically get you into a development of religious maturity, which is called a rushd. And we talked about rushd from Surah Al-Hujurat. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ وَاعْلَمُوا how does the ayah start? وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ فِيكُمْ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ فِيكُمْ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. Let's continue that ayah. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ فِيكُمْ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ لَوْ يُطِيعُكُمْ فِي كَثِيرٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْرِ لَعَنِتُّمْ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانَ وَزَيَّنَهُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ وَكَرَّهَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْكُفْرَ وَالْفُسُوقَ وَالْعِصْيَانَ وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ فِيكُمْ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ لَوْ يُطِيعُكُمْ فِي كَثِيرٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْرِ. And know that the Prophet is amongst you. And of course, that was when he was amongst them. Okay. But right now, the Sunnah is amongst us. Right now, the Sunnah, the resource, is basically available to us. If he were to obey you in your interpretation or in your data, anecdotal or whether it's empirical, لَعَنِتُّمْ, your life would get into a lot of struggle. But your Lord Almighty, حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانِ, but he beautified faith to you. And he made it lovable to you. And then زَيَّنَهُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ, and beautified it in your hearts. كَرَّهَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْكُفْرَ وَالْفُسُوقَ وَالْعِصْيَانَ, and made disbelief and fusuq, basically major sin, and al-'isyan, and minor sin, be hated to you. So what does that mean? Well, that's basically letting us know that حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانَ, that's the start. You just have to walk the walk of faith and discipline in order to get to أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الرَّاشِدُونَ. Those are the ones that had developed religious maturity. And this is extremely important. That certain maturity. Yes, you can get a degree, you can get an education, you can get a PhD in philosophy, in I don't know, physics and chemistry, whatever it is. You can get those degrees, and yes, you may have probably understood certain logics or certain data, certain studies, whatever it is, probably mastered a certain interpretation or probably mastered a certain data reading, etc. But not until you basically master the vision that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically told you was the center of your life, and basically master how to read the data based on the Quran and Sunnah, and mastered how to interpret the world around you based on Quran and Sunnah, not until then would you be considered as mature. But how do I also develop maturity? Well, one, certainly there's ilm that you could study, whether it's Quran, Tafseer, Hadith, etc. That ilm is one side. But just because you studied Islamic sciences, that doesn't necessarily make you mature until you apply it. Applying the religion, applying the ilm is a different form of ilm. Islam tells us that there's a certain level of maturity, rushd, that you could only get. In other words, your brain has a certain area that it can learn through giving it that knowledge and explanation, and other ilm, you would have to put it into practice. I cannot teach you how to swim just by telling you move your legs and your arms and legs. But there's a certain training that you would need to basically get into the pool, get into that swimming in order to really train your brain how to think swimming. You would really need to train your brain how to think certain activities. There are certain activities you would have to be within, let's call it hands-on, to really train your brain how to think in that way. If I were to tell you, here's how you play basketball, here's the object of it, here's the physics. Think of a triangle at that basket right there, and if you were to throw it with this amount of force, within this angle, within this, you can do all the explanation in physics. Good luck, and you can be an expert in that. But when it comes to you shooting a basket, you will say that somebody that didn't know the physics that you had been laying out and telling me about all that math and the physics and the momentum and the weight of the ball and all of that. Quite interesting, okay, to know the knowledge of it, the science behind it. But to really know how to shoot a basket, you would have to basically do a lot of training in order to learn how to use a certain amount of force based on distance, based on the weight of the ball, based on the height of the basket. All of that takes training. And then your brain starts mastering with time, even though you may not know any of that physics that was explained, but your brain learned how to create these roads and basically learned how to understand all of this, not through the knowledge of it, but through the discipline. And that's the same thing with a lot of the different things in the religion. It's about discipline. You may not fully understand the whole math and physics of it, but work on putting in the discipline until you understand the philosophy and the math, or whatever you want to call it, logic, whatever it is. Learn how to put it in discipline, even if you may not understand it fully. Even if you may not understand it fully. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, ذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَهُ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَكْسِبُونَ الْإِثْمَ سَيُجْزَوْنَ بِمَا كَانُوا يَقْتَرِفُونَ. Avoid that. And the Lord Almighty is letting us know that sin slows down your ability to process, that is basically discipline, has the power to discipline or expedite your ability to process the ilm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically laid out. That's why شكوت إلى وكيع سوء حفظي فأرشدني إلى ترك المعاصي وأخبرني بأن العلم نور ونور الله لا يهدى لعاصي. That's why that poet, he said, I had complained to Wakia the lack of ability to memorize. And he guided me to avoid sin. And he told me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge is light, and light is not given to sinners. So in other words, what did he want to say? He said, well, there's a discipline. If you put in that discipline of lowering the gaze, of not speaking ill, of doing all number of different behaviors in a different behavioral discipline, that's going to help your mind basically get into the focus. Your behavior affects your progress in your mental ability, in how it is capable of remembering, how it is capable of understanding, how it is capable of interpreting the data that it collected. But you need to make sure that you get into the right discipline. وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرُ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ وَإِنَّهُ لَفِسْقٌ وَإِنَّ الشَّيَاطِينَ لَيُوحُونَ إِلَى أَوْلِيَائِهِمْ لِيُجَادِلُوكُمْ وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ. But al-Qurtubi, in regards to this ayah, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرِ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, he said there are 5 different things that he wanted to discuss in that regards. The second one is this question. When he said, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرِ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. So, I mean, it's really easy to say, okay, if the person says, Bismillah wallahu akbar, that, okay, this is halal. Okay, if they slaughtered it right. Okay. But if the person says, let's say, in the name of other than Allah, it's a pretty clear one that well, other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was invoked here, therefore we're going to regard this as haram and not halal dhabiha. It's a pretty straightforward one. But here's the question that al-Qurtubi and the other scholars had proposed. They said, when the ayah said, وَمَا لَكُمْ أَلَّا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. So the question is, or here, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. Eat what had the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What if no name was mentioned at all? Okay? No name was mentioned at all. And this was a Muslim slaughtering. That way there would be no question and no going into the details. We're not talking about a Hindu just not saying anything and just slaughtering. Okay? Because we already know that that is not the biha. That the biha should be done by Muslim, Jew, or Christian. Okay? That's number 1. Number 2, we're looking at what they're slaughtering. So that's number 2. Number 3 is that it would basically, if it's done by a Muslim, they're going to say Bismillah Allahu Akbar. If it's not done by a Jew or Christian, it must be not done by other than the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if they had said, invoking on the name of Jesus Christ or whatever, Mary or whatever the name that they, or the cross or whatever, then that would not be halal to eat. Not because a Christian had done it doesn't make it halal, because now they're using the cross, or they're using the name of the cross, or in the name of Jesus Christ or whatever, and that would basically make it not halal. Okay, now what if no name was said? That's the question. A Muslim slaughtered, didn't say anything. They just slaughtered, and and chopped it all up and basically distributed it? That's the question. And that's basically what they had discussed. So the question of not saying any name, why not saying any name? Whether they had forgotten or whether they were deliberate about it. So we're talking about a Muslim leaving in the name, whether deliberately saying, well, you know what, you don't even need to say anything because this is an action and not necessarily something that I'm doing for Hajj. I'm here, I'm a farmer and Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. We basically had these machines, okay? These machines, we would hang all these, these sheep on there, and then it's just these machines that would just slit. Or do we have to hire somebody to just say every single time you would see this machine run across their throats, you're going to say Bismillah Allahu Akbar, Bismillah Allahu Akbar, Bismillah Allahu Akbar. All right, are we going to do that? Or are we going to say, well, no, we don't have to? Well, let's see what the scholars had said. Number one, the first opinion, they basically said if the person had left it sahwan ukila jami'an. That was the first interpretation. That was the first opinion. The first opinion said if they had left the tasmiyah, Bismillah Wallahu Akbar, they left it. Okay. If they left it forgetting to say it, they said you would still eat from it. And this is the opinion of Ishaq ibn Rahaway or Rahoya, two different names for him. And Ishaq ibn Rahoya or Rahaway, by the way, Rahoya in their language actually means priest or sheikh. Okay, so is it Rahoya? Most likely it's Rahoya and not Rahaway. Anyhow, and also Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal basically tells us that it's a Hanbali opinion. But if they had deliberately avoided to say Bismillah Wallahu Akbar, then it's not halal. That's the first opinion. So the first opinion considered it depends on whether they had forgotten or whether they were deliberate about avoiding to say Bismillah. The first opinion, if they left it by just forgetting about it, you could just eat it. But if they were deliberate to leave it, then don't eat it. And whose opinion was that? Said that was Malik ibn al-Qasim. So Ibn al-Qasim is Abdul Rahman ibn al-Qasim. Okay, he's also from the Maliki madhab. Let me just give you an idea about one thing. Every certain school, so if you were to have, let's say, the Hanbali school, you're going to have certain scholars that are considered as the leading figures within that madhab. So for the Hanbali, for example, you will have Ibn Aqil, you will have Ibn Rajab, you will have basically these, or for example, certain books as well. You got al-Kashaf, you got al-Furu', Ibn Muflih, etc. So those would be the main endorsed and approved resources for that particular madhab. If you're going, for example, the Maliki, you'll have al-Mudawwana, you'll have al-Fawakih al-Dawani, you'll have Matan Sidi Bouzaid. These are the references. Okay, those are the references. So you'll have certain figures, certain scholars. You'll have Ibn al-Qasim, Ibn Sahnoun. Those would be, certain figures. This isn't everybody, okay? But al-Qarafi, you'll have certain figures that are considered as main figures within the Maliki madhab, Asad ibn al-Furat, etc. Okay, within the Hanafi madhab, you're going to have the key ones. You're looking at Abu Yusuf, you're looking at Zufar, you're looking at Abu al-Hasan, okay? You're looking at key figures within the Madhab Hanafi. If you're looking at Madhab al-Shafi'i, okay, you're looking at al-Muzani, you're looking at al-Ramli, you're looking at certain figures. And by the way, for certain books, I forgot to mention for Madhab al-Hanafi, okay? You're looking at certain books for al-Hanafi madhab. whether we're talking about Hashiyat ibn Abdin, you're talking about Bada'i al-Sana'a, those would be considered as the main books. Of course, there are more, but I'm just giving you, just Al-Hidayah is the main one, but we're talking about, just giving you some Al-Mabsut, etc. Those would be for Al-Madhab al-Hanafi. Okay. And each and every single one of these resources that we just talked about, some of them, like, Badi' al-Sana'a, for example, is only in 6 volumes. But if you were to look at Al-Mabsut, that's in like 23 volumes. Okay. Or Hashid ibn Abdin, that's like 21 volumes. Okay. And same thing if you're talking about Al-Madhab al-Shafi'i. Madhab al-Shafi'i, whether you're speaking about النووي being a main reference, الرافعي being a main reference for Madhab al-Shafi'i, and certainly we already know Shafi'i, but you want to keep in mind, why am I getting into these? Because I know you see a lot of names. Some of these names would belong, like Ibn al-Qasim, he would belong to the Maliki anyways, okay? But when you look at Abu Hanifa, he would belong to a different school, which is called Ashab al-Rai, okay? And you may see that other names, like when he would say Al-Thawri, Al-Hasan, Isa, Asbagh, Ibn Jubair, Ata, guess what? What many do not know is that people like Ibn Jubair, Sa'id ibn Jubair, okay, he actually had his own madhab. All right. Ata ibn Abi Rabah, he actually had his own madhab. He didn't adhere to Abu Hanifa's madhab. Okay. Because anyways, Ata ibn Abi Rabah was even before Abu Hanifa. Okay. Ata ibn Abi Rabah, he was considered a tabi'i. Okay. He died 110 Hijriya. Abu Hanifa, okay, he was born 80-year Hijriya and he died 150. So the time when Abu Hanifa was in the midst of gathering the resources and that information, okay, Ata ibn Abi Rabah was, yes, in Mecca. There were some reports that he probably got some information from him, but not really evident. But at the end of the day, is that Ata ibn Jubair died 95 Hijriya, which basically lets you know that someone like Abu Hanifa never got to meet Sa'id ibn Jubair. Abu Hanifa was born 80-year Hijriya. Well, guess what? Imam Malik, okay, Imam Malik, he died 179 Hijriya and never met Ata ibn Abi Rabah and never met Ibn Jubair either. Okay. And you look at these figures, they had their own madhab, but many would think of just the 4 madhab and not realize that there were actually other scholars that are more than those 4 madhab. So why don't we have madhab Sa'id ibn Jubair? We do. But guess what? It just wasn't documented in details. So we don't know much about it. There were some attempts to gather the information about, let's say, Madhab al-Thawri, Madhab Sufyan ibn Uyayna, those madhab, but we don't have all the, let's say, the primary sources that would date back all the way to them. Because if we're talking about another scholar telling me that that's what Sufyan ibn Uyayna had said, that's a secondary source and not a primary one. Well, that's what that other scholar said, but that's not a primary source that traces all the way to, let's say, Sufyan ibn Uyayna. So a lot of those attempts to bring about the tracing to knowing, for example, madhab Ata ibn Abi Jubair or madhab Ata ibn Abi Rabah or Sa'id ibn Jubair, etc. All the attempts, they basically failed because we don't have primary sources that lead all the way to them to really say this is what their madhab was in each and every single matter. And that's why it's very important to just understand when we look at these categories. And by the way, when you specialize in fiqh, it just will take you just reading it once. You will just read this once and you will be capable to just know each and every single opinion. Boom, 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 boom. Just by looking at the names, you're like, yep, okay, now I know. Okay, I can repeat all of this just by reading it. If you have the math of it basically clear, which scholars belong to which school and which scholars basically use this kind of methodology to come about with a fatwa, etc. So this is extremely important. Let's go look at the second opinion. The second opinion said if the person had left it deliberately, left what? Left saying Bismillah Allahu Akbar, or they had forgotten it, whether, in other words, whether they had left it, they purposely just avoided to say Bismillah Allahu Akbar, or whether they had forgotten, they said you could still eat from it. That's the opinion of Shafi'i. Al-Hasan, Al-Hasan is different than than Shaybani for Madhab Hanafi. Okay, and let's say, and now look at this one. روي عن ابن عباس وأبي هريرة وعطاء وسعيد بن المسيب. And it was also a narration upon Ibn Abbas, Abu Huraira, those are two Sahaba, Ata. I thought you said Ata was there. See, that's what I wanted to get to. Sa'id ibn Musayyib as well, or Ibn al-Musayyab. Okay. Now, you could see Ata, for example, this is a secondary source. So you had two different opinions on what really did Ata really embrace in regard to that opinion. And that's why he used the word ruwiya. Ruwiya means it was mentioned upon him, or basically upon Ata, that's the opinion that he had embraced. Whether a person deliberately left the Bismillah Allahu Akbar, or whether they had forgotten that you could still eat. Okay, and Jabir and Zayd and Abi Iyad and Tawus and Ibrahim al-Nakhai, all of those, even Tawus, he had his own madhab. Ibrahim al-Nakhai had his own madhab. Abdurrahman Abi Layla, he had his own madhab. Qatada, well, definitely he had his own madhab. Okay, and Abi Rafi, he had his own madhab. Okay, and let's see. الزهراوي عن مالك ibn Anas. Why is it الزهراوي عن مالك ibn Anas? That's another narration for al-Maliki madhab. Why is he emphasizing al-Maliki madhab? Because he is Maliki madhab. Because al-Qurtubi is Maliki madhab. So he said that opinion that it was narrated. I thought you said earlier that Malik and Ibn al-Qasim, who's also Maliki, that they had said if they had left eating it, if they had left not eating it, but if they had left saying Bismillah Allahu Akbar by deliberately leaving it, that you would not eat it. Let's say right here. And he said here's a second opinion upon Ibn Malik that you would eat it if the name was forgotten, whether it was deliberately left or whether it was forgotten, that you could still eat from it. So you've got two different opinions. One, you can eat from it, and the other one said you cannot eat from it. And let's say another scholar, he said, at-tasmiyatu sunnah. Here's that another interpretation. That saying Bismillah Allahu Akbar is not obligatory, but is actually a sunnah. What is a sunnah? A sunnah basically means it was a practice that was done by the Prophet ﷺ. You would get rewarded for saying it, but not held accountable for leaving it. Okay? And therefore, if the person had forgotten it, according to this opinion, you would still eat that dhabiha, which is also, he said, qawlu Malik. You would still eat it even if you had forgotten it. And if you had left it on purpose, or whether, that's a third opinion, if you had left it saying Bismillah Allahu Akbar on purpose, or whether you had forgotten about it, that it's completely haram and you cannot eat from it. Muhammad ibn Sirin, he's got his own madhab, he said that. Abdullah ibn Ayyash, ibn Abi Rabi'a, that's basically one name. Abdullah ibn Ayyash ibn Abi Rabi'a, he was a great scholar. It definitely needs more let's say, more information than just saying he's a great scholar. Abdullah ibn Umar, Nafi', Abdullah ibn Umar was basically a Sahabi. Nafi' was a Tabi'i. Abdullah ibn Yazid al-Khatmi was Tabi'i, I think. Don't take my word on that. الشعبي, Abu Thawr, Dawood ibn Ali, and well, Shabi was, I think, a Tabi'i, Abu Thawr. So here's that name that I talked about earlier. Dawood ibn Ali, well, that one came way later. Okay, let's see. The fourth opinion, if you had left it on purpose, it would be hated for you to eat it. Why? Why? He said because the person had left it on purpose when they could have said it. Okay, let's see. Ashab, another scholar, he said, well, there's a difference between if a person had forgotten it and if a person was just too mustakhifan. What is mustakhif? Mustakhif is a person that considers things of always, oh, don't be too serious about it, not a big deal. So basically not giving it the honor. Not giving it the honor that it deserves. That's al-istighfaf. So if it's like, not an issue, it's istighfaf. You basically just consider that it's not a big deal, not serious. Come on, that's istighfaf. That's to not honor the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so Al-Qadi Abu Bakr, I wonder if he's talking about Abu Bakr al-Baqillani here. But he said, يجب أن تعلق هذه الأحكام بالقرآن والسنة والدلائل المعنوية التي أسستها الشريعة. This is a keynote. He said, it is obligatory that we would relate the different rulings to the Quran and Sunnah, and with the different evidences that relate to it that were founded upon Sharia. As for in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, and eat what had the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned on it. And he had also said, and do not eat the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name was not mentioned on it. And in both circumstances, he had basically clarified the ruling. And he said, do not eat. And therefore, we couldn't assume that it was hated, but we are to basically say that we cannot take things out of their context and say that things can be forbidden and can be hated at the same time. They're either going to be forbidden or they're going to be hated at the end, regarded that it depends on the person's intention. If their intention was to somehow not take the matters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seriously, then that person probably went into the parameters of nifaq. Okay, let's say, and that's why that takes us to the third quote that he had said. He said, if a person were to leave the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have three different circumstances. The first one is that the person might say, now they've got three different hypotheses. The first hypothesis is, number one, is that the person put the animal, basically laid out the animal, hey, used their force, maybe got another man to basically help him. And he said, well, my heart is full of faith. I connect to, and I just prayed and I just had wudu. So to say Bismillah Allahu Akbar, why is it on my tongue? I have it on my heart. Okay. So that's that first scenario. And therefore they said, well, that's not enough to say I've got the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in my heart, because just by having the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your heart is not enough until you actually say it. Because dhikr, when the ayah says dhukira smullahi alayh, meaning that it was uttered, not that it was believed and concealed within your heart. That was the first one. The second scenario, إن هذا ليس بموضع تسمية. They said, well, this isn't a place to make this dhikr, because I'm not here doing a sacrifice as a sacrifice as in Hajj or on the day of Eid al-Adha. I'm just doing it not as a sacrifice. But yes, I'm here slaughtering this, but not as a religious duty, but as a dunya matter. So let's say that opinion, they said, well, even though, you know, لكونه على مذهب يصح اعتقاده اجتهادا للمجتهد فيه. So he said, well, we would still consider that that's a considerable opinion, because according to the scholars that said that that's permissible, then we wouldn't necessarily say right away that this ijtihad, that this inference is necessarily wrong. And it would be right for those that would embrace that opinion. Let's say the third opinion, or the third scenario, they said, I'm not going to do any naming, and I'm not going to say any, what is important about the naming. In other words, they were really dishonoring that. And then in that situation, that would be متهاود كافر فاسق لا تؤكل ذبيحته. Whoa, that's a strong one. Why? Because just to keep that one in mind, this isn't just in the scenario of the biha, but the same thing if, for example, within the same inference, if, let's say, a woman, a Muslim woman, said, oh, come on, it's not like the hijab is going to somehow get you to Jannah. That's so stupid to think, or make fun of hijab, or to make fun of, so here it is. You want to tell me that polygamy somehow is going to protect certain people from zina. Yeah, it's probably their problem that they have to lower their gaze, that they have to do this and this. And that's, it's like, okay, I can probably give you a dismissal for probably saying that they have to lower their gaze, fine. But to start speaking as this tahawun, what is it, tahawun? To speak in disrespect, to speak in dishonor, dishonoring the rules, the parameters, the legislation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is kufr, is fisq. It's getting you out of the parameter of Islam. And it's also fisq. The least to say is that this person had just committed a major sin. And remember, al-fisq is two kinds. Al-fisq is major fisq and minor fisq. Major fisq is kufr. And therefore, we cannot eat from that dhabiha. Just keep that one. And Ibn al-Arabi, look at that one. I want to look at the adab right there. Ibn al-Arabi is Maliki. But Ibn al-Arabi was not a Maliki that was a phonetic Maliki. What do I mean by phonetic Maliki? There are some scholars that may be really phonetic about a certain madhab that they might follow. And I mean really phonetic, just like al-Jassas. Really phonetic about al-madhab al-Hanafi, as an example. Okay, well, he was really phonetic. Al-Jassas was really phonetic about al-madhab al-Hanafi. And he would sometimes even support a non-authentic hadith and use that as a reference just to support the madhab and support their school. Ibn al-Arabi, this guy that we are seeing right here, Ibn al-Arabi, right there, okay? Ibn al-Arabi was from the Maliki madhab, but he was not a phonetic Maliki. In fact, a very important quotation that he had said in regards to a dispute between scholars, and that is do we get zakah and is every produce basically eligible for zakah? Or does it have to be within basically dates? Do we make and give zakah for apples, for, I don't know, bananas, whatever that we're probably harvesting? And we're talking about large amounts, okay? We're not talking about your garden that's probably barely giving you your couple of fruits and vegetables and probably passing on to a couple of neighbors. No, we're talking about huge amounts, okay? Do we do zakat on that? Scholars actually had differences of opinions, but Ibn al-Arabi, he went against his madhab Maliki on that opinion in particular. And he said, as for Abu Hanifa, he had made جعل القرآن مرآته فأبصر الحق. He said, Abu Hanifa had made the Quran be the lens that he sees through, and he saw the truth. Look at that endorsement. Even though he's not in the same madhab, but he recognized by studying the evidence objectively, and he didn't let his madhab influence the way that he would read what makes something right and wrong. The center is not the madhab. The center is the evidence. The center is Allah Almighty. The center is the Quran and Sunnah. If we have an authentic, one, resource, two, the data basically is showing within that hadith or ayah, and three, we've got the interpretation that basically matches it, then we would have to fall in submission to the evidence of Quran and Sunnah, regardless of the interpretation that madhab carried. And then, despite that, he said, وَأَعْجَبُ لِرَأْسِ الْمُحَقِّقِينَ إِمَامُ الْحَرَمَيْنِ. That's speaking about al-Juwayni. And then he said, ذِكْرُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى إِنَّمَا شُرِعَ فِي الْقُرَبِ وَالذَّبْحُ لَيْسَ بِقُرْبَةٍ. He said, I find it strange that the head of the scholars, like Imam al-Haramain, had mentioned that the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was only regarded as its place, as in ritual, and slaughtering in itself is not necessarily a ritual. He said, and this contradicts the Quran and Sunnah, because the Prophet ﷺ said, مَا أَنْهَرَ الدَّمَ وَذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ فَكُلْ. When the Prophet ﷺ had said, what had got that gushing blood out and the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was mentioned on it, then eat. So therefore, if somebody were to say that they had the name of Allah in their heart, well, that basically would contradict a person forgetting about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the place of forgetting is basically in the heart, but the place of remembrance is in al-qalb. But al-Bara ibn Azib had narrated a hadith, Ismullah ala qalbi kulli mu'min, samma aw lam yusammi. The name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in the heart of every believer, whether they had, in other words, uttered it orally or not. And that's why, what's one? Let's go to 1 and see. Now, here's the thing, is that although al-Qurtubi had mentioned this hadith, but the ones that had researched and revised all the different hadith in al-Qurtubi, they said, لَمْ نَقِفْ عَلَيْهِ مِنْ حَدِيثِ الْبَرَاءِ. Said, we have no trace to prove that it actually is narrated upon al-Bara, except Ibn Qudama fil Mughni. Ibn Qudama fil Mughni was the only one that said that this hadith traces back all the way to al-Bara ibn Azib. And he said, but this hadith is actually da'if. It's actually not authentic.
And Ibn Adi had also mentioned that it was upon Ahmad ibn Hanbal that it was actually not authentic. And same thing when you're talking about ad-Daraqutni, who basically combined those ahadith as well. And you could say, أَعَلَّهُ ibn al-Qattani كما في نصب الراية. Ibn al-Qattan, Nasb al-Raya is not, Ibn al-Qattan is not the writer for Nasb al-Raya. But Nasb al-Raya is Zayla'i, that is. Where's Zayla'i from? Zayla'i was a Hanafi madhab. And Zayla'i was originally from Somalia. He wrote this Nasb al-Raya. What did he do? In Nasb al-Raya, it's a 6-volume book. But that is one of the most important books in fiqh al-hadith. What does he do? That book, for Zayla'i, in 6 volumes, okay? What he did was go back to those ahadith, specifically for hadith that were, well, they're all in fiqh, okay? But then for al-madhab al-Hanafi. And then he would go and research the authenticity of these hadith. And then he would classify ahadith al-khusum, those that had opposed al-madhab al-Hanafi, and then what evidences they based their madhab on, whatever, they based that opinion on. And then he would research those ahadith al-khusum, research those ahadith and say, well, the opposing opinions, and those are their evidences. And then he would do a very objective research and study in those ahadith to make sure that we are basing the fatwa not based on our own interpretation, but based on the evidences in Quran and Sunnah. Okay, so just looking at that one, let's see, is Zayla'i fi Nasb al-Raya basically said, okay, so that this hadith is mursal and ولا يعرف بغير هذا. Okay, so at the end, here we go. Let's see. Al-Qurtubi wanted to comment on all the previous opinions. And he said, قُلْنَا الذِّكْرُ بِاللِّسَانِ وَبِالْقَلْبِ والذي كانت العرب تفعله تسمية الأصنام والنصب باللسان فنسخ الله بذكره في الألسنة واشتهر ذلك في الشريعة حتى قيل لمالك هل يسمي الله تعالى إذا توضأ فقال أيريد أن يذبح. What did he want to say? And he said وأما الحديث الذي تعلقوا به من قوله اسم الله على كل قلب مؤمن فحديث ضعيف لا تلتفتوا إليه. What did he say? He said, and we would say in response, that is al-Qurtubi wanted to say, mentioning the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the tongue, that is orally, and in the heart, and that's what the Arab used to do. They would name the different idols and the different things that basically monumental things, basically, that they would resemble as sanctuary things. They would name it in tongue. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had abrogated all that and had mentioned that it is important to mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the tongue, meaning orally. And it had become very famous in Sharia when, that is, in Imam Malik, when he was asked, do you say Bismillah if you were to make wudu? And he said, why? Are you going to attempt to do the biha? In other words, it became so famous that during the biha, especially, that you would say Bismillah Wallahu Akbar. He said, as for the hadith, that they had based it on that Ismullah ala qalbi kulli mu'min, that the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually on the heart and in the heart of every believers. He said that hadith is actually weak. Do not even why did he put it in brackets? He put it in brackets, لا تلتفتوا إليه, because in some of the quotes in Ibn al-Arabi, he said, لا تلتفتوا إليه, that was an addition from the reference in Ahkam al-Quran for Ibn al-Arabi, and that's who quoted this quote of Imam Malik way before al-Qurtubi. Let's see. Some scholars actually said tasmiyah is not obligatory, and they said because the Prophet ﷺ, when some people had come to the Prophet ﷺ and they asked him, we had people bring us meat. We're not sure if they had mentioned the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on it or not. The Prophet ﷺ said, Sammullaha wa kulu. He said, say Bismillah and eat. Okay, you could see this hadith is also mursal. We're almost done. We're going to get to all the way there, and that's it. He said there are no differences of opinions that hadith is mursal. What is mursal? Remember, if we don't know the complete chain of narration all the way to the Prophet, so we've got a missing link, a sahabi, then in that situation, we're going to say it's one of the 69 different classifications of different kinds of hadith da'ifa, but there are some, just like a Shafi'i, he considered that just because a hadith is within mursal, that doesn't necessarily make it to be rejected if we would have other resources and other reports basically fortify, let's say it that way, and enhance that narration to prove that it basically has at least other resources to support that it is not necessarily a missing link, but we know that the where it traces back to. And let's say he said at the end that was in the beginning of Islam, that they had to say, or this ayah was revealed, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرْ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, that ayah was revealed in the beginning of Islam. But Abu Umar, who's Abu Umar? Ibn Abd al-Barr, he said that's actually a weak interpretation. And in fact, within that same hadith, there's something that responds to it and refutes this the statement. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered them to say Bismillah, and therefore the ayah is the ayah was basically revealed at the time, and also letting us know that saying Bismillah is key. He wanted to defend his idea and say, well, that was in Medina, and no scholar would disagree that this ayah, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرْ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, that it was revealed in Mecca. So when you say وَإِنَّهُ لَفِسْقٌ, does that mean does that mean a minor or a major fisq? Okay, is it a major or a minor fisq? Well, it depends based on those scholars. Okay, you're going to then go back to their scholars and back to the inference that we had worked on in all these details, and then you're going to say, okay, now I get it. You're going to say, okay, so if somebody says that this is haram, if a person were to dishonor the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that would be major fisq. But if the person just didn't really disregard or not give the honor to the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they just thought that wasn't that important. Oh, come on, I don't have to say it because I'm not doing a qurban. And in that situation, some scholars would actually call it, it's a minor fisq, just say Bismillah Allah Akbar, because right there, you would say Bismillah even for the food that you eat. Why wouldn't you say Bismillah Allahu Akbar for the meat that you would slaughter? Okay, now that we laid out all those different opinions and we definitely passed the time, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
As a conclusion, after this brief explanation about ولا تأكلوا, about ذكر الله on the ذبيحة,
Right.
تأكل مما لم يذكر اسم الله عليه. At the conclusion of this great and
Okay. So,
wide
and
explanation, what we can say about the meat in America and the restaurant?
okay, fair enough. So the meat in America, or even in many Western countries, okay, that meat, it's not, the problem is not whether the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned on it or not alone. That's not the only problem. Okay. Then, because if I were to have a Christian or a Jew not mention any name and just slaughter, we would eat from it. The problem there is not the remembrance and the mention of the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The problem there is in the process of bringing the animal to death. So do they use, sometimes they'll use like a mallet, hit it on its head, or probably soak it in water, okay, drown it, that is, and waterboarding, or probably using shooting and just, shot it in the head, all of that. Those, if that is the method that was used, then even if it's a Muslim using this method, that would be haram. Okay, now here's one thing. Depends on the country, depends on the laws that govern that area. So you've got the Department of Agriculture. They would oversee, they would lay out the different laws and consider that, this is the method that they would use, because scientifically they are capable of seeing. So they would have inspectors basically coming in, inspecting how and what method is used to kill these animals. But to stay on the safe side is always best. That's to make the story short. To stay on the safe side and only eat what was supervised as halal is always best. But would we still consider that the animals, let's say you're going to, just your store next door and you had beef right there. Should I buy from that beef or should I not buy from that beef? It's best if you don't buy it to stay on the safe side. But just to keep in mind that the Department of Agriculture in most states, not all, that they would consider that you would have to slaughter the animal by throat and not shoot it. But that's not the truth in all states and all farms. Some farms still use the method of shooting or hitting it on its head and then slaughtering. Okay. Now, one thing is that they would still slaughter, right? They would still slaughter, but how soon after, let's say, shooting it did they slaughter? How soon? If they shot it on its head, and then maybe 20 minutes later, the guy went, grabbed a cup of coffee, then came in and started slaughtering the throat, then that was a dead animal. But if they shot it on its head and within almost 2-3 minutes, then they basically slaughtered it, most likely that animal died not as a result of the shot, but as a result of the slaughter. Unless, you're looking at the bullet, you're looking at where it hit, etc. Yeah, certain triggers or certain area of angle might actually bring the animal to death for the first shot. Okay, from the first shot. Then in that situation, just to keep in mind, that somebody that is not Muslim is not going to take this matter seriously. But to you, this is deen. So it's always best to buy what is considered and labeled as halal, but I would not necessarily right away, depends on the area. Like in Minnesota, we had we had the Fiqh Council basically go to the slaughterhouses in Minnesota and actually see that these slaughterhouses, butcher houses, whatever you want to call them, that they are actually slaughtering, and that it was halal, even though the label of halal was not there, but it was actually halal and they were slaughtering. Is that the case in each and every single state? The answer is no. Not every state basically considers in their Department of Agriculture that this is what and how you have to slaughter. Not every state has the same law. So if you are in Oregon, you are in Tennessee, you are in different states, they would have different rules. Every single state has its own law, and every single country. I don't know how it is in Belgium and France, and I don't know how it is there. So the best thing to do is really look for the ones that have halal label, just to make sure that you basically are eating halal dhabiha and not eating something that they didn't take seriously. Eating halal is religion, is discipline in Islam. It has its influence and its impact on your deen. So taking this matter seriously is وَمَن يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِن تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever regards the rituals of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as places of being, places to take seriously, that's a reflection of the religious integrity, the taqwa in it. So I hope I answered that question, dear.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. So the issue is that the biha, that the blood supposed to be released, like Islamically released, all of it from the.
So that's not the only thing.
Yeah,
okay?
blood, Bismillah.
Let's just assume that I basically had shot the heart. Is the blood released? Yes, the blood is released. Let's say I slaughtered from the heart. Is the blood released? Yes. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have the sunnah for camels, they would basically get into nahr. The way you would slaughter a camel is nahr. The way you would slaughter the animals is basically slitting the jugular vein. So that's the key thing. Okay, so the way you would slaughter chicken, the way you would slaughter, let's say horses or not camels, but let's say beef, goats, etc. Beef is the meat, but goats, sheep, cows, you would basically have to slit the throat. Okay, did I explain that one? And then say Bismillah, Allahu Akbar. We talked about the details of Bismillah if a person had forgotten it or not. Okay, but then the key thing is to do that. In Nahr for camels is different because their anatomy is different.
Yeah. So all of them is through the neck. So I would die.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
What about the gelatin capsule, please?
For gelatin, there's actually a huge debate on that. Let me break it down for you. When you boil the bones, okay? When you boil the bones, that basically gets that collagen out, and that basically would form the substance for gelatin, okay? That collagen that is out, okay? And then certainly they don't just use it like that and just use it like that, but there's a chemical process that would basically go through a process to make it something that, one, it's not just changing the color, but it's also getting it firmer, it's getting it into a different form. It basically is using it, a whole different process. Now, there are different opinions on that. Number one is that some scholar, the first opinion, basically said it must be halal in order to consider that gelatin of it as halal. So in other words, halal slaughter, and then we got the bones, then we boiled them, we got the collagen, we got the gelatin out and all of that. And then, in other words, it has to be a halal source. That's the first opinion. Second opinion, they said, no, because we're boiling the bones. We're boiling the bones, and the substance that got out, this is the water. This is the collagen. And that was the opinion, ironically, that al-Madhab al-Zahiri considered that no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that lahm al-khanzir is what's haram, and not the not the skin and not the bones. That
But
was
what about shuhum?
yeah, hold on. Yeah, they considered that for al-Zahir, al-Madhab al-Zahiri, they said it's not haram. Okay, I'm laying out the different opinions. Okay, hold on, not too fast. Okay, third opinion, they said no, it's halal. Why? Not because it's not from the flesh and all of that. Why not? The third opinion said no, it's halal because it goes through a process of istihala. And what is that? They said, well, istihala is when you have a completely different process. Like what? Like, for example, we fermented grapes, and with this fermentation, they went through the process of containing a certain level of alcohol, and then therefore we fermented even longer, and it became wine. And hey, we could do a different process and even turn this wine into vinegar. Now it doesn't have alcohol in it, but now it's a vinegar. So this is that istihala. It's a completely different process. It became into a completely different chemical. So some scholars considered that, hey, since the origin of it is non-halal, assuming that it's non-halal, then in that situation, with this process, it processed into a completely different substance. They said it goes into istihala. Same thing. They said, if we were to heat alcohol and use it in our cake, we put it in the oven. We're not talking about tiramisu and using wine over the cake and putting brandy over the cake and basically, coffee and brandy and all of that and making the perfect tiramisu. That's not what we're talking about. That's a different thing. We're talking about putting in the batter and then putting in the oven, putting alcohol, wine in the batter, and then putting in the oven. Okay, that's what we're talking about. So the istihala would tell me that, yeah, you put it in the batter, you put it in the oven, and once you put it in the oven, the alcohol basically through heat, it basically let go from some of its elements, and now it's a completely different composition. Then therefore, they said it went through istihala. Same thing when we're talking about gelatin. They said it went through istihala. The other scholars that said, sorry, we disagree with you that it went through istihala, said, no, it didn't go through istihala. Why not? They said istihala is when the origin of the substance is not there. Well, why do you say it didn't go through istihala? We could see it's a different substance. I said, sorry, it's not. It's not a different substance. Why not? They said, well, because remember, you took this product, and if we were to go to a biochemist, they're capable of knowing the source of this. The source of this, whether it's beef, or whether it's or whether it's pig, or whether it's a different animal, they're capable of knowing the source of it. So just by knowing the source of it, you would know that it didn't go through istihala, but that's kind of like going from grapes into raisins. It just became a different appearance. That doesn't mean that it's a completely different substance. It just looks different, but it's the same thing.
But then they responded and said, well, I mean, we don't have to. We're not going to be looking under the microscope because Islam didn't ask us to look under the microscope of things, but just the appearance of it. And they said, oh, we're not going to buy that. What do you mean the appearance of it? We're not going to buy that. And those scholars, they said, we're not going to buy that. We're going to call it haram. And it would only be halal only if there's no alternative. So your vitamin D, the gel cap vitamin D, they said, you've got an alternative halal, go for the alternative halal. But then the scholars, the other scholars, they said, well, I mean, what if there was an alternative? They said, well, we agree with you. If there's no alternative, then yeah, we have to have the ummah create an alternative without haram. But we still don't necessarily recognize that it's necessarily haram, and we still think that it went through istihala, and therefore my vitamin D gel caps, I'm just going to take it because anyways, I still believe in the opinion that it went through istihala and that I'm not obligated to use a microscope to see some little tiny DNA or a genetic component that probably lies deep within. So I'm laying out all the differences of opinions. So when we have differences of opinions that have this kind of debate, what's the best thing to do? Avoid the differences of opinions. Avoid al-khuruj min al-khilafi awla is the general qaida. Avoid the differences of opinions is always best. Find the alternative. If you cannot find the alternative, then taking something that has gelatin is a considerable opinion that it went through istihala. It's a considerable opinion, but always on the safe side. I hope I answered that one.
Sure. Jazakallah khairan.
وإياكم. Sorry for sometimes going into details, but you know, mashallah, you ladies are right now really advanced, right? Where's Rishma? Rishma, you guys are really, right?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, we are advanced and we're trying to grow in our ulum in Islamic sciences. And yes, it's not, you know, sometimes we could see, you know, in the men's area, we could see sometimes they can go advanced, but right now I think we also need to get those sisters to also getting advanced ilm and not just the basics. So ladies, it's not a competition with the men, but it's basically a
Inshallah.
competition for the akhirah, right?
Yeah,
It's a competition for the akhirah.
that's
So
our main aim, what you say.
absolutely, this is the ikhlas. This is al-ikhlas. It's not competing with the men because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us, where the Prophet sallam, إِنَّمَا النِّسَاءُ شَقَائِقُ الرِّجَالِ. Men are the brethren.
It is between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a connection between me and my Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like that.
Absolutely. So I'm trying to go deep down, and I know
Inshallah.
some of you, it's like, okay, you got me lost in those resources. Write down what you can, little by little. You'll get to see it little by little. Maybe one day we'll make an advanced class on how to research in the books of fiqh. And right now that it's, you know, it's available and you can translate it. Hey, this is great.
May I leave, Maulima? I have to attend one at 10 o'clock. 1 minute left for me.
All right. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.